Next up on our agenda is Ken Cassar, who is the principal of CassarCo, Strategy Analytics. And Ken is going to be presenting a number of data looking at what consumers are doing, this idea of the post-pandemic consumer. So Ken, I'd like to bring you up to our virtual stage to get started.
All right. Thank you very much, Scott. And thanks everyone for joining this afternoon. I'm going to switch my camera off. The title of today's presentation, The State of the Post-Pandemic Consumer, might imply that the COVID-19 pandemic has passed. Sadly, by post-pandemic, we mean the period after the pandemic began, which obviously we're in the thick of. We're in an unprecedented time when an understanding of the consumer is shaken to her core couldn't be more important. Frustrating, though, to get insights that are fairly clear in this environment. We'll try to do our part to use the next 20 minutes or so of your time to illuminate the consumer in ways that you've not seen. A little bit about us. For those unfamiliar with CassarCo, we are a strategy and analytic consultancy focusing on bringing alternative sources of data to the retail industry, providing competitive context that goes beyond the internal data that retailers have available to them. We're also announcing the launch today of CassarCo's first data product, which you'll learn a little bit about ahead. A core tenet at CassarCo is that no one source of data has a monopoly on the truth. In the spirit of providing a multi-dimensional view of the consumer, we'll present you with a delicious stew with three different forms of data. First, Commerce Next partnered with BizRate Insights during the beginning part of July to field a survey of 1,055 Americans, representative of the US population, that we'll use to shed light on consumer attitudes and intents around shopping. We'll also talk a little bit about the Census Bureau data that Sucharita had referred to. Using their advanced monthly trade statistics that are made available each month about halfway through the following month. That data is considered a fairly definitive source. It certainly moves financial markets, but it tends to present data at a very high level. It's monthly, it's a little delayed, there's no connection to the consumer, geography, online visibility is relatively poor. And so to plug some of those gaps, we're going to use data from what we call the context report, which is CassarCo's first report in partnership with Affinity Solutions. Affinity Solutions collects data from 90 million credit and debit card holders in the US. At the top line, the data correlates well with census data, but it allows fairly important double clicks on consumer spending. We can see spending at the daily level. We can see online and offline broken out for omni-channel retailers. We can track to demographics, we can track behaviors longitudinally, and we can see data down to the retailer level. All of these slides will be available after, so don't feel like you've got to frantically take screenshots in order to keep up. Just sit back, relax, and enjoy the presentation. As Sucharita has pointed out, while the U.S. retail economy has been battered, we are seeing clear signs of recovery. The glass is certainly half empty. Maybe apropos of the moment, the half empty, half full glass may be filled with vodka, but there is good news. We're going to start with a slightly different view of the U.S. Census Bureau data. Here we're looking at retail gas and restaurant/bar sales going back to July 2019. The red line looks at monthly retail sales for the past 12 months. The blue line looks at sales from the same month last year. So it's a year-over-year comparison. One of the tricks with the way the media interprets the Census Bureau data is that they tend to do month-on-month as opposed to year-on-year, which is, I think, more useful for retailers where seasonality is important. The dip in sales that we see during April and May, looks somewhat innocuous, but that represents $103 billion in lost sales net, despite the increases that we saw in certain places. But by June 2020, we see that levels of retail sales were virtually flat compared with June 2019. Pretty amazing thing, especially when you consider that unemployment is currently at 11%. Discretionary categories were particularly clobbered. Apparel retail sales, for example, were down an almost unthinkable 86%, and this includes online sales. By June, apparel sales were down 24% relative to the year before, which passes for good news in the apparel space. I believe that the pandemic has at least temporarily breached the mental partitions that used to exist in consumers' minds, separating different categories of discretionary spend, as consumers' discretionary budgets were basically set to zero during COVID lockdowns. It's increasingly about this or that, not this and that. Put another way, retailers are competing with other discretionary pots of money like they never have before. So let's shift to some survey data. Here we're looking at the first slide from that Commerce Next BizRate Insights survey that we had talked about. In this particular question, consumers were asked what activities they missed the most during COVID-driven lockdowns. At the top of the list, cited by 49% of respondents, dining out. Surprise to me. Shopping for fun is on the list, and by fun we mean for non-discretionary items. That came up number 7 on the list, cited by 17% of respondents. Women were more likely than men, 21% versus 9%, to have responded shopping for fun. But if our theory that discretionary budgets have become unpartitioned, this ought to be a concern for retailers, particularly those that have been forced to cut back on marketing spend with increasingly tight budgets. Moving to better news, in this question of the survey, respondents were asked which type of goods do you have plans to buy but have delayed purchasing because it's been difficult to shop during the pandemic. Obviously, we're trying to get at pent-up demand here. Given the poor apparel sales that we saw between April and June, it's not surprising that apparel tops the list in terms of pent-up demand, more for women than men. It's interesting that we still see some pent-up demand in home categories, despite the fact that they performed well during COVID. Health and beauty is number 3 on the list, particularly amongst women. We suspect that this is principally within beauty, which has suffered just about as badly as apparel. Looking ahead, we ask consumers about their plans to spend during the critical upcoming back to school and holiday seasons. Consumers are evenly divided. 48% of people said that they plan to spend the same as last year. 47% of people say that they plan to spend less. Few say that they plan to spend more. If we peel back the onion, here we're looking at those same survey responses for different income groups. Less than 50,000 in annual household income, 50 to 100,000 and 100 plus. And what we see here is that households with less than 50,000 in annual household income are probably, not surprisingly, more likely to plan to cut back than those with more than $100,000 in income. But we see that affluent households plan to be only a little bit less frugal than everybody else. While back to school is here, and I think consumer sentiment right now is probably a decent read on back to school. Holiday is pretty far away, and I would probably take some of this with a bit of a grain of salt. Speaking of economic intent, some of you may recognize John Maynard Keynes, the economist credited with the idea that government stimulatory spending is necessary in times of economic duress. He sort of provided the intellectual underpinning for the New Deal during the Great Depression. Let's see how spending is held up during COVID and how well Keynesian economics have held up. Now we're going to take our first look at that credit card data set from Affinity Solutions that I had told you about. What we're doing here is comparing spend for each week during COVID against the same week last year by income group for the same less than 50, 50 to 100, 100 or more, February through April. We can see that before COVID had hit, we were in a very strong position amongst all income cohorts, between 5 and 8% up relative to the previous year. Then we can see some stockpiling, which bumped spending up briefly before we saw kind of a free fall in consumer spending. We'll call the last week in February normal. And then those weeks at the end of March, beginning of April, the pits of despair. As we might expect, spending decreased amongst all groups when we compare normal to the pits of despair, but spending declined less, 4 points less, in fact, among less affluent households, because more affluent households tend to have larger discretionary budgets. And discretionary spending was obviously hit very hard by COVID. When we look ahead and expand this analysis through the end of June, and we overlay the timing of stimulus payments, the story gets pretty interesting. The sharp increase in consumer spending that we saw suggests pretty strongly that the stimulus money made a big difference. The Keynesians among you are undoubtedly cheering. We can also see that, as designed, the spring stimulus particularly benefited the less affluent, whose spending increased by 22% compared to just 15% for those 100,000 and more in income. The dip that we see at the last week of this period toward the end of June may be attributable to the July 4th holiday and the calendar. It may also be attributable to growing concern about the rise of COVID in regions that had been relatively free of it before. Obviously, we're all watching pretty closely to see what comes out of Washington, D.C. in the days ahead. The rest of the world seems to be a bit of ahead of us in terms of stimulus. Chinese economy is rebounding, and we've got a sort of fairly significant differences between Democrats and Republicans that we hope will be resolved relatively shortly. Next, we're going to change gear and look at the online story. And we'll start by going back to the census data. Remember, red line is this year, blue line is the same month last year. When the June census data dropped a few weeks ago, there was a lot of attention in the media given to the fact that non-store retail sales had declined slightly. This was technically true, but very misleading for a few reasons. This obscures the fact that non-store retailers' share of total retail sales actually increased from 23% of retail sales to 30% from May to June. And it also doesn't include omni-channel retailers. So there are some important parts of the story that we're missing. In order to get at those missing parts of the story, we're going to dive into our credit card data set. In order to really understand the impact of online sales, we need to be able to look at online-only retailers as well as omnichannel. In this chart, we're looking at the online share of total retail sales by week, and we're excluding restaurant and gas. The COVID spike, which is circled in red, almost rivaled levels from holiday 2019, accounting for 28% of retail spending at its peak. I do want to note that this includes grocery, which is a huge number relative to the rest of the retail picture, where online penetration rates are still low, but much higher during this particular period. We also see online penetration rates coming back down to earth, kind of on the right-hand side of this chart, bumping up around the 25% neighborhood. However, many online buyers experience less than optimal shopping experiences during the COVID lockdown, suffering out of stocks, long delivery waits, site outages. And so the big question is whether those experiences have cast online in a poor light, potentially suppressing future e-commerce opportunity. To answer that, we'll come back to our Commerce Next biz rate survey. Of everyone surveyed, 50% of the people told us that they had been compelled to buy more online because of COVID and the store shutdowns that came with COVID. Among that group of people, 53% said that their online shopping experiences during COVID had not changed their opinions about e-commerce. 38% walked away with more positive views on e-commerce. Only 9% were more negative. We do believe that this data, combined with the continued strength that we're seeing in online sales, suggests that consumers have largely forgiven some of the COVID trip-ups that we saw. Now we're going to double click on those digital shopping experiences. In the survey, consumers were asked about shopping related things that they were compelled to try out during COVID lockdowns for the first time. 43% of respondents told us that they had tried curbside pickup for the first time. We do believe that curbside, as opposed to in-store pickup of online orders, well, I'll just leave the camera on. The curbside, as opposed to in-store pickup, is going to become a minimal expectation on behalf of consumers. Retailers in the past had always tried to force consumers into the store to pick up their online orders with the hopes that they would buy something else. We really believe that the door is closing on that opportunity. Retailers that want consumers to go into the store are going to have to provide them with some incentive to do so. 23% of the consumers that we surveyed tried a new delivery vendor, Instacart or DoorDash, for example. If we go way down the list, we can see that 13% of consumers said that they used mobile devices to pay in store for the first time. I'm not quite sure what to make of this number. I might have guessed that it would have been higher, but we might not have seen the breakout that some might have expected. The last thing that we want to do is go micro. We love macroeconomics, but we're very interested in microeconomic stories where there are winners, losers, and lessons for everybody. As we'll see, there is evidence that COVID has significantly altered the competitive retail environment in ways that may well outlive the virus. And this is the premise, really, of CassarCo's first data product, the Context Report: Retail, which provides retailers with an understanding of the landscape around them. The final handful of slides that I'll show you will reveal some of the competitive insights. I think a pretty interesting story that can be gleaned, all with data that's available to retailers now. The microeconomic story that we're going to focuses on three value-oriented family apparel retailers: Kohl's, JCPenney, and Old Navy. Each of these guys was impacted by COVID as profoundly as any other retailer in the apparel sector. And if we track total sales for the aggregate of these three retailers, that's online and offline, February through the end of June, we can see that as consumers were beginning to gear up for spring, COVID hit, taking 79% of sales out of the mix for these retailers in a matter of 3 weeks. But then we see that sales start to rebuild in May as stores are reopening, leading to a mid-June peak that actually, believe it or not, was higher than levels in the pre-COVID era. Now we're going to bring online into the picture. So the blue bars represent the data we were just looking at, total online sales. The red line represents the online share of retail sales for the three in aggregate. We can see that retail sales didn't entirely disappear for these retailers during the pits of despair, thanks to e-commerce, which accounted for virtually 100% of sales during mid-March through mid-May. But let's now hone in on JCPenney in particular. Looking at their online sales by week. If we're jcpenney.com, we might be reasonably happy. Average weekly sales during the pits of despair were actually up 9% from the pre-period. And then the sales in the period after that were actually up 16% from the period prior. So things are looking okay given the pandemic until we overlay some competitive context. When we do that, we can see that Kohl's and Old Navy's online sales skyrocketed during COVID. We can see that JCPenney lost significant ground to its competitive set, who both saw dramatically more significant increases in online sales. It's pretty clear with this perspective that JCPenney missed a pretty significant opportunity. It might have been because of reduced marketing spending. It might have been because of limits on e-commerce capacity. It could have been driven by their consumer base, whatever it was, or it may have been a combination of other things. But the net effect of all that was that JCPenney's share in the pre-COVID period dropped from 34% amongst these three retailers to 23%. That's an 11-point drop. But the thing that's even more distressing for JCPenney is the fact that this share loss persisted into the late stage. When the category was rebounding both online and in-store, JCPenney was left behind. Their share that had dropped to 23% during the peak has not rebounded. This is obviously particularly bad news as JCPenney announces plans to close 150 or so stores. I think kind of the key point that I want to quickly make here is just think about how differently each of these companies would have reacted had they the benefit of all that situational awareness. So now I hope that everybody's enjoyed our little mathematical spin through the U.S. retail economy, and let's close with some high points. First, all things considered, there's cause for retailers to be optimistic, and by optimistic, we specifically mean invest in marketing, invest in online. The fiscal stimulus that occurred during the spring clearly pulled the U.S. economy out of free fall. You might want to call your congressperson to encourage them to get moving. Online penetration is coming down. We don't believe that it's going to come down to pre-COVID levels. Investments in online, again, are critical. Finally, COVID has fundamentally reshuffled the competitive deck for retailers, and we think it's more important than ever that retailers have competitive visibility. Slides will be available from Commerce Next for all attendees. For anyone that wants the unabridged deck with all of the outtakes, the director's cut, just visit CassarCo.com/getthedeck, and we'll be able to get that unabridged deck over to you.